Hi, I'm Pastor Kerry. Sometimes there is a fine line between ambition and audacity. Sometimes there is a fine line between ambition and arrogance. I'll give you an example. Over the course of your life, you have probably gone for a job interview or two, and over the course of those job interviews, you have probably been asked more than once, where do you see yourself in 5 years? Now, of course, the proper answer to that question is, 5 years from now, I would like to think that I would be with this company, and I'd like to think that I would be advancing in the leadership of this company. And then, of course, the person who's interviewing you writes down, oh, very good, shows a lot of ambition. Wonderful, excellent candidate. On the other hand, if you say to the interviewer, 5 years from now, I hope to be your boss. 5 years from now, I hope that you are answering to me. What's the job interviewer going to write down at that point? My goodness, very arrogant, full of himself, full of herself. Not a good candidate for this job. And really, when you think about it, you basically gave them the same answer in either case. The difference is that the first time around when you said, 5 years from now, I hope that I am still with this company. I hope that I'm advancing through the leadership in this company. Well, that was more tactful than saying to the person, 5 years from now, I hope I'm your boss. 5 years from now, I hope that you answer to me. And that's how it goes sometimes. Sometimes there is a fine line between ambition and audacity, between ambition and arrogance. And in the lectionary passage for Sunday, October 17th, I'm afraid a couple of the disciples appear to cross that fine line. This coming Sunday, we're going to be taking a look at the Gospel of Mark, chapter 10, verses 35 through 45. And if you haven't already done so, what you can do is go down right now into the notes below this video, and you can print off the sermon notes for today. So, once you have those in hand, let's go ahead and take a look at our lectionary scripture. Once again, Mark chapter 10, verses 35 through 45. And we're going from the Message translation. James and John, Zebedee's sons, came up to Jesus. Teacher, we have something we want you to do for us. What is it? Jesus replied. I'll see what I can do. Arrange it, they said, so that we will be awarded the highest places of honor in your glory. One of us at your right, the other at your left. Jesus said, you have no idea what you're asking. Are you capable of drinking the cup I drink, or being baptized in the baptism I'm about to be plunged into? Sure, they said. Why not? Jesus said, come to think of it, you will drink the cup I drink and be baptized in my baptism. But as to awarding places of honor, that's not my business. There are other arrangements for that. When the other 10 disciples heard of this conversation, they lost their tempers with James and John. Jesus got them together to settle things down. You've observed how godless rulers throw their weight around, he said, and when people get a little power, how quickly it goes to their heads. It's not going to be that way with you. Whoever wants to be great must become a servant. Whoever wants to be first among you must be your slave. That is what the Son of Man has done. He came to serve, not to be served, and then to give away his life in exchange for many who are held hostage. May God bless the reading of the Word. So this is an interesting story from the Gospel of Mark, and there's actually a parallel version of this over in the Gospel of Matthew. Let's first of all do what we always do. I want to talk through the passage. I want to put a little finer point on some of the verses in this passage. And then after we talk through the passage, then I want to focus on 3 of the things I think we should remember from the passage. So the very beginning of the passage tells us that we have James and John. And James and John were very close to Jesus. We know that Jesus kind of had an inner circle among the disciples, and the members of that inner circle were Peter, James, and John. So right here we've got 2 of the members of that inner circle. They are brothers. They're the sons of Zebedee. And it tells us that they went to Jesus and they said, Jesus, we need a favor of you. Jesus says, what is it? And they say, when you are in your glory, We want to be at your right hand and your left hand. And I think that you probably understand the implications of that, but basically that meant that they wanted to be, if Jesus was first in charge, then they were asking to be the second and third in charge. If Jesus was going to be the general, then they wanted to be the first and second lieutenant generals. And at this point, it's important for us to understand also, or important for us to remember, that as far as they were concerned, they were still expecting Jesus to be a political Messiah. They were still expecting Jesus to usher in this political kingdom. That they were expecting Jesus to overthrow their Roman oppressors. And so there was an expectation that they had that they really were going to be political leaders in this messianic kingdom, in this restoration of the great nation of Israel. And again, it just speaks to the fundamental misunderstanding that all of the disciples had before the crucifixion and the resurrection. They really didn't get what was happening. So Jesus initially responds by saying, "Do you think that you're capable of drinking the cup that I'm about to drink?" And of course, to us, when we hear the cup with reference to Jesus, our thoughts probably go to communion, but that wasn't what Jesus was talking about at all here. Instead, there was an understanding that they had in biblical times that drinking a cup was a reference to accepting one's fate. And a lot of times the implication was it was going to be an unpleasant fate. Remember how when Jesus was in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he prayed and said, "Father, if it is possible, take this cup away from me. But not my will, but yours be done." So Jesus is saying something similar here to the disciples, to James and John, and saying, "You really think that you can drink the cup that I'm about to drink?" And he says, "Do you think that you can be baptized in the same baptism I'm about to be plunged into?" And of course, again, you and I, we think of baptism and we think of the beautiful Christian ceremony of baptism. But we have to remind ourselves that there was a double meaning for baptism as well 2,000 years ago. And back in that culture, there was the meaning of baptism that was the washing in the water, like John the Baptist had performed baptism. Not long after this, the disciples are going to be performing baptisms. But there was also the implication of destruction. Jesus in Matthew chapter 3 talked about baptism by fire. And so that's a reference here as well. And so Jesus says, "You think you can drink the cup that I'm about to drink? You think that you can experience the baptism that I'm about to experience?" And James and John go, "Sure." And so Jesus says, "You know what, guys? You're right. As a matter of fact, you are going to drink that cup. You are going to experience that baptism." And those were prophetic words on Jesus' part. Because out of the 12 disciples, and eventually it would be 13 once Judas took his own life, and once Matthias replaced Judas. But out of the 12 disciples, the first one to be martyred for his Christian faith was James. He was the very first. Acts chapter 12 verse 2 talks about it. And then what's interesting is that out of the 12 disciples, John is the one that, according to Christian tradition, and of course this isn't actually found in the New Testament, it's just Christian tradition. But according to Christian tradition, John was the one out of the 13 who never was actually put to death for his Christian faith. However, you might recall that John spent the end of his life exiled on a desert island called Patmos. That was where he wrote the book of Revelation. And in some ways, I would almost contend that that was a fate worse than death. Regardless, Jesus says, "Yeah, you know what, fellas, you're right. You are going to drink the cup. You are going to experience the baptism." And so, after this, Jesus has this understanding all of a sudden, or this realization that there's a fight that has broken out among the disciples. And at this point, the other 10 have found out what James and John had asked of Jesus, and they're all mad at James and John. And I would contend that they may have been mad because they didn't think to ask Jesus first. And so they're mad that James and John beat Jesus to the punch And so Jesus has to go and has to settle the argument between all of them. And Jesus, of course, sets them straight. And what Jesus says at the end of the passage is, of course, the profound, lasting lesson that we're supposed to take away from this passage. And at the very end of the passage, Jesus talks about if you want to be great, you need to become a servant. If you want to be first, you need to be willing to be a slave. And there are two Greek words there that I actually remembered. And you've heard me probably laughingly tell you before that I remember practically no Greek from my New Testament studies 30 years ago. And I'm proud to say that this is one of the very, very, very rare instances where I remembered the Greek. The Greek word for servant is diakonos. And from the word diakonos, we get the English word deacon. That's exactly right. And the Greek word for slave there is doulos. And actually, I just read a book not too long ago where it referred to a servant as a doula. So that's where that came from, in that English book as well. So, thanks for letting me geek out a little bit. It's very rare that I actually remember any of my Greek studies from Bible college. Let's do this now. Let's go ahead and let's talk about the things that we should remember from this passage. The first thing I think that we should remember from the passage is this. Sometimes we need to keep our ambition in check. Sometimes we need to keep our ambition in check. And here's the thing. I think that one of the good qualities that we have as a society, as a culture, is that we say to our children that they can be anything they want to be. We don't ever tell our sons or our daughters, no matter what their skin color, orientation, anything else is, we don't ever tell them, well, you can't do this or you can't do that. What do we do instead? We tell our sons and our daughters, you could be the president someday. And that's a good thing. I think that's a great aspect of our culture. But at the same time, I think that some parents, not a lot, but some parents take that a little bit too far. You know what's interesting? Here's the funny thing. I told you that this passage that we just read, that there's a parallel account over in the book of Matthew. And the funny thing is that over in the book of Matthew, it is actually James and John's mother who goes to Jesus and basically says, hey, Jesus, I want you to have James and John at your right and left hand. I want you to have my sons at your right and left hand in the Messianic kingdom. So, you may hear people talk in this day and age about the idea of helicopter parents. Well, it would appear, at least from the parallel account of this over in Matthew, that there was a helicopter parent 2,000 years ago. And friends, look, the bottom line is this. Ambition is good, but sometimes all of us, myself included, in fact, I am probably extremely guilty of this. Sometimes ambition can cross a line into audacity. Sometimes ambition can cross a line into arrogance. And you and I need to make sure that we are not ever on the wrong side of that line, because James and John were on the wrong side of that line, obviously, in this passage. That's the first thing for us to remember. The second thing for us to remember is this. Sometimes we need to remember that power can corrupt. Sometimes we need to remember that power can corrupt. Now, I know some of you are thinking to yourselves, well, duh, Pastor Gary, we all know that power can corrupt. But I think that it's a good thing for us to talk about in the context, particularly of this passage, because again, we're saying to our children that they should be ambitious. But I think all of us have seen examples, countless examples over the course of our lives of people that we loved, people that we felt were individuals of excellent character that got into positions of power, and they did exactly what Jesus talked about in this passage. Jesus said, "You've observed how godless rulers throw their weight around. When they get a little power, how quickly it goes to their heads." And I just think about how little has changed over the last 2,000 years. And you've heard me say this before, that the world that we live in, especially in this day and age, is changing so rapidly. The world that we live in has practically nothing in common with the world that Jesus and the disciples lived in 2,000 years ago. Our worlds are different as night and day. But you know what is exactly the same? The human heart. The human nature. Human nature has not changed over the last 2,000, 3,000 years. When you read about these men and women in the Old Testament and the New Testament, and you read about their character, you realize that human nature hasn't changed in thousands and thousands of years. So, power can corrupt. You know that. I know that. But thankfully, we need to make sure that when there are people in positions of power, whether that's in our church or people that we know in the community, whether it is our representatives that are in government, we need to first of all hold them accountable, and then we need to pray for them. I think that's one of the most important things that you and I can do. That's one of the most important things that you can do for me. Those of you who are members of Southview that are watching the sermon video this morning, that's one of the most important things that you can do for all of the leaders of this church, is pray for them. Pray that they would continue to be people of good character, that they and I wouldn't let whatever power, and I know that you're thinking, well, there's not a lot of power in a church, and you're right, there's not, but still, it's there. And so that we wouldn't let that power go to our heads, that we would continue to be people of good character. That is the second reminder we should take away from this passage. And friends, the third and final, and by far the most important reminder this passage has for us is this. Sometimes we need to be reminded that we're called first and foremost to serve. Sometimes we need to be reminded that we're called first and foremost to serve. Because, friends, I think that for a lot of us, when we are called and when we are in positions of leadership, that we are looking for ways that we can maybe bring more attention to ourselves, maybe we can hopefully turn that into some goodwill. Sometimes, unfortunately, people will try to curry favor with others. And friends, that's not what we're called to do. Those of us who are in positions of leadership, those of us who aren't in positions of leadership, all of us, no matter who we are, no matter what our role is, all of us, as followers of Christ, we are called simply to serve. That is our job. And friends, the funny thing here, or I guess the not so funny thing here, is that this moment in Jesus' ministry took place not too long before Jesus and the disciples would find themselves in the upper room. And do you remember what happened when Jesus and the disciples first found themselves in the upper room? When they first got there? You remember when they first got to the upper room, what they were supposed to do is they were supposed to have their feet washed, because you had to do that before the Passover ceremony. And so they're looking around, and there weren't any servants there to wash their feet, so what do you do then? Well, then you got to figure out who's the low man on the totem pole among the 12 disciples, and that guy's going to have to wash everybody's feet. And so what happened? They all started arguing with each other. Well, I'm greater than you. Well, I'm greater than you. Well, I'm greater than you. Well, I'm not washing your feet. And who was it that, without even being asked, just went around and started washing everybody's feet? That's right. It was Jesus. So, friends, my hope is that you are a better listener and that I am a better listener than the disciples were, at least at this point in their lives and in Jesus' ministry. Friends, that's where we're going to leave off today. Next week, we're going to go back to the book of Hebrews. You might recall that last week and the week before that we had been talking about the book of Hebrews. We're going to go back one more time to the book of Hebrews next Sunday, and we'll look forward to seeing you then. Thanks for joining us this morning.